benedictat in
Hello, welcome to Historia Ecclesiastica. My name is Daniel Sudi. In this next installment in the Atheism and the World Wars series, we will be looking at the Catholic response to secular academic thought, especially the Catholic response to Marxism. Let's get started. We begin with the prayer of Pope Leo XIII, one of the great popes who helped lead the Church through the beginning of the dark period of the Enlightenment that really we're still struggling through. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Most glorious Prince of the heavenly armies, Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in our battle against principalities and powers, against the rulers of this world of darkness, against the spirits of wickedness in the high places. Come to the assistance of men whom God has created to his likeness, and whom he has redeemed at a great price from the tyranny of the devil. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. I like beginning with that prayer in particular because this shows us that Pope Leo XIII was aware that the intellectual darkness that had fallen over Western civilization in the century after the Enlightenment was connected to a spiritual darkness which had fallen over the former kind of homeland of Christendom. So please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Please do at least one of those. Appreciate all of your support. I truly do. And let's get started with today's video here. In this video, we'll be examining, of course, how the Catholic Church engaged with Enlightenment thought in either a dialectical relationship or in a more of an adversarial relationship. And I began the previous video where I thought I was going to be talking about this, reviewing that 100 years after Enlightenment scholarship and 100 years after the secular academic world became thoroughly atheistic, Pope Pius X would respond, as he is famous for, responding with a resounding hammer with the so-called war on modernism. In his famous encyclical, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, he explains that even though he would rather, condemn the modernists privately, he knows that because he is the Pope, he has a duty to defend the honor of the Catholic name before these secular intellectuals who have infiltrated the very intellectual institutions of the Church, corrupt the name of Catholic by teaching as Catholic doctrines secular and atheistic ideas. And so Pope Pius X would respond very vigorously against modernism, and he would encourage bishops to only thoroughly give permission for texts to be published with nihil obstats or imprimaturs after they had been examined very carefully. He encouraged bishops to thoroughly watch all theologians within their dioceses to make sure that none were advancing modernist ideas. As we discussed previously, for this, Pope Pius X has a bit of a negative reputation. Father John O'Malley, Jesuit, said that St. Pius X's accusatory and fierce response to modernism had few precedents in the history of the papacy, which is a ridiculous claim, as we'll see. Father Mark Massa described the modernist crisis as being a harrowing series of intellectual witch hunts. Joseph Kelly wrote that Pius X was, quote, afraid of modern academia, which Joseph Kelly was implying that Pius X didn't understand modern academia, and therefore he was afraid of perhaps looking ignorant when he didn't understand what all these super smart atheistic intellectuals were saying. Father Thomas Bokenkotter, another historian, said that St. Pius X's anti-modernist crusade called for, quote, measures that smacked of the worst features of the medieval Inquisition, end quote. I said in the previous video, I find that humorous because most would say burning heretics at the stake was the worst feature of the medieval Inquisition, but I guess Pope Pius X, writing stern encyclicals condemning modernism, was just as bad in his opinion. George Weigel, a conservative, for most people would say, George Weigel was a conservative kind of political thinker, but he became very involved in describing church matters, and he still is a very influential church ecclesial columnist. He was actually tasked by St. John Paul II himself to write his own biography, so that shows the amount of respect that John Paul II had on George Weigel. But George Weigel said of St. Pius X that he was, quote, steeped in clericalism, end quote, and that his ignorant prejudice of modern academia, quote, puts the life of the Catholic mind into something of a deep freeze. Okay, so even George Weigel is kind of singling out Pope Pius X for being overly harsh when it came to his treatment of modern academic thought, especially as it infiltrated church theological and philosophical thought. are all of these, Catholic historians justified in singling out St. Pius X for his campaign against modernism? Or was St. Pius X simply continuing the campaign against modernism, which had been waged by each of his predecessors throughout the 19th century? That is the question we'll be examining in this video. I mentioned in the previous video that if you want to see full footnotes and academic sourcing for all the information talked about here, please download my book, The Missal of St. Paul VI, The Complete History of the Novus Ordo Mass, because all the research you see here, or most of it, comes out of this text that is on Amazon. So let's go back now to the 19th century, to the very dawn, the beginning of the intellectual dark age known commonly as the Enlightenment. In the very beginning, there was a degree of dialogue between Catholic theologians, philosophers, and Enlightenment principles. To begin with, the Gallican/Jansenist theological, ultimately would be deemed a theological heresy, but in the origin of that movement, it wasn't quite clear the status of that movement. So it was basically a theological tradition that was kind of reminiscent of John Calvin, his soteriology of double predestination. That's what it's most known for. However, Jansenism and the Gallican movement in the Church of France gained popularity because it was perceived by French people of embodying their French nationalist spirit. It dialogued a lot with French Enlightenment thinkers, and as a result of that, the Gallican and Jansenist movement, which they basically are one movement in the later stages, they went hand in hand. Jansenist priests, who once again are most known for believing in double predestination, which reduces free will to non-existence, they believed in what you could call liturgical reductionism. They believe there should only be Mass on Sunday. They believe the church should be devoid of sacred art. They believe the altar should not have any dressings, and they believed in a vernacular liturgy as well, because they were trying to reduce basically the liturgy to what could be verified as its empirical value. So, like, if you were to really analyze it with sort of like the mind of an Enlightenment thinker, what would you see as the value of the liturgy? They started to see the value of the liturgy as being to basically edify the people, because that's what you could see happening here on the world, here on the earth. The traditional notion of the value of the liturgy is not to edify the people. It is an important part of the liturgy, is edifying the people, but the reason you go to worship is to worship and to offer sacrifice to God. Edification takes place when you're going to worship. If you go to be edified, you're no longer worshiping, you're going for this self-serving purpose, and then you won't be edified because you're going in, thinking about what can the liturgy do for me, rather than how are you going to offer sacrifice to God there. So that's how Enlightenment affects the liturgy. And you may think that sounds familiar to attitudes about the liturgy today, and there's a reason for that. We're living in a society that's now saturated with Enlightenment thought, and that sort of attitude of like, okay, well, I'm going to the liturgy for myself. What do I get out of Mass? I didn't get anything out of that Mass. I liked that Mass. I didn't like that Mass. That perspective of like, how do I like the Mass? How is it serving me? That's happened to us because of the Enlightenment affecting our views of the liturgy. We should go to Mass just wanting to worship and offer sacrifice with this supernatural orientation, not this worldly orientation. So anyways, like I said, Jansenism was uniquely French, and it fit into the popular nationalism of the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, causing it to grow and grow and grow. Now, the Jansenist Synod of Pistoia that kind of lays out their vision for the Church of France, and this took place in 1786. It voiced Jansenist positions, and it proposed a vernacular liturgy, a merger of all religious orders to have just one habit, and to take no perpetual vows for whatever reason. It also encouraged a sharp separation of church and state. And if you've watched the previous videos on the Enlightenment thought, you can hear kind of the voice of Voltaire speaking through the Synod of Pistoia. Now, the Synod of Pistoia is 1786. It wasn't condemned until 1794. It would be condemned by Pope Pius VI 1 year after the French Revolution. The French Revolution made it very clear to the Church of the wickedness of Enlightenment thought. If there was any doubt at all, once the French revolutionaries massacre 3 bishops and over 200 priests, and drive about 30,000 priests into exile, it's clear where Enlightenment thought is leading. And so the Synod of Pistoia is recognized as emerging out of Enlightenment thought. And so immediately after the French Revolution, the Synod of Pistoia is flatly condemned by Pope Pius VI. He would be later imprisoned. Pope Pius VI would be imprisoned by General Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798. He would die in imprisonment 18 months later. We'll talk more about him in the next video on the secular states. He's not considered a martyr, but maybe one day he'll be recognized as one. I would not at all see any objections to that. He died in captivity, likely as a result of his captivity. Okay, so the Jesuits, Claude Bouffier, and he lived from 1661 to 1737, and then René Joseph Tournemine, another Jesuit, who lived from 1661 to 1739. This is before the events we just talked about, but they utilized Enlightenment methodologies to write Christian apologies, trying to reach out to Enlightenment thinkers by using their own kind of styles of writing, and they were recognized as being contributors to theological thought by early Enlightenment thinkers. So there was a little bit of healthy dialogue in the beginning. The French Father Nicolas Malebranche attempted to synthesize the thought of Augustine and Descartes. He died in 1715, so once again you can see some dialogue taking place in the early Enlightenment. In the 18th century, Father Benedict Stadtler, who lived from 1728 to 1797, he also made use of Descartes, Leibniz, Locke, and Hume in his own theological writings. So in the very early period, we did have some dialogue between Catholic theologians and Enlightenment thinkers, but as I mentioned in the middle here, the French Enlightenment would sort of put an end to that at all healthy dialogue, and the Enlightenment would be seen, rightly so, as antagonistic to faith, not open to discussion with theology, as Baron de Holbach would say in his article. His famous article is titled "No Need for Theology," where he would mock the very idea of theism. And so Enlightenment thought, secular, atheistic, secular academia is going to start moving in one direction, and Catholic theology and philosophy is going to move in another one. Like I said, the French Revolution was what caused these two movements to utterly sever once and for all. As I said, 3 bishops and over 200 priests were massacred by various mobs of revolutionaries by 1793. In 1792, all nuns in France were forced to leave their convents and re-enter secular life, getting married or else living as a consecrated virgin on their own in their own homes, finding whatever work they could find. Various monasteries of men were confiscated by the state, leaving those monks exiled. And by the year 1800, over 30,000 priests were driven into exile. Tellingly, in 1793, so the very year of the revolution, on November 10th, a strange and horrifying ritual took place in Paris, which was called the enthronement of the goddess of reason. And so all the clerics were driven out of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, one of the most famous churches in all of Christendom. And the French revolutionaries dressed up a prostitute, and they called her the Goddess of Reason. They led her up to the high altar of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and they bowed down and burned incense before her, saying they were basically overthrowing God and faith, and they were enthroning reason, personified by this prostitute that they found on the streets. So this was perhaps slightly satirical, certainly demonic, and it was emerging from the actual thought of the Enlightenment thinkers. This sort of thinking did formalize into a formal quasi-atheistic religion in the 1830s, when Auguste Comte formally founded the Church of Positivism, which basically mimicked all Catholic sacraments and Catholic holy orders and hierarchy, but instead of worshiping God, worshipped reason itself, and reason isolated from faith. Of course, Catholics are not opposed to reason. We are responsible for the high levels of reason in Western civilization, as we talked about in the previous video. But the Church of Positivism wanted to basically Auguste Comte believed that you couldn't get rid of people's desire to be a member of a religion, so he was seeking to replace the church with the Church of Positivism, or empiricism. And it would spread to various nations. It wouldn't become that popular. Actually, it became more popular in Brazil than it was in France. And in fact, if you look at the Brazilian flag, the phrase "Ordem e Progresso" comes from a famous quote from Auguste Comte. The motto "Order and Progress" was a phrase borrowed from this religion, and it is still on the flag of Brazil to this day. This picture here is a church of positivism, where they would talk about science or something. Okay. So when Pius VI forcibly condemned the Synod of Pistoia for its intellectual innovations in 1794 and its attempts to merge French nationalism and secular thought with Catholicism, the Synod was actually particularly condemned in one instance for avoiding the use of scholasticism and traditional language when treating of the Church's precious trove of dogma. So the participants of the Synod were attempting to think of new modern language to describe timeless dogmas, and this in and of itself was condemned. Not necessarily because they had spoken heretically, but because they were avoiding the use of traditional language. Pope Pius VI argued that this was dangerous and suspect of heresy. He especially condemned the Synod of Pistoia for not using the term transubstantiation in its treatment of the Holy Eucharist. He deemed this, once again, suspect of heresy. There's no good reason to not use a term which so adequately safeguards the sacred mystery of who is and what is the Holy Eucharist. Pope Pius VI, like his predecessor, Pope Pius VI, like the Pope who would come right after him, would be imprisoned in 1798 after condemning the Synod of Pistoia. French military forces, led by Napoleon, confronted Pope Pius VI. They gave him an ultimatum. He would either be imprisoned and kidnapped, or he could renounce all claims to temporal power in the Papal States. He refused, and he would die in captivity 18 months later. Okay. After the French Revolution and the condemnation of Pistoia, the papacy established itself as firmly opposed to all Enlightenment intellectual strains. One example of this is that between the years 1738 and 1909, 21 papal pronouncements or encyclicals were written condemning Freemasonry. As we said, Freemasonry is basically the foot soldiers of the Enlightenment trying to organize sneakily into the institutions of all of the Western states and advance secular Enlightenment-inspired ideals into all the governments and even intellectual establishments of those countries. In 1800, St. Pius VII, the successor to St. Pius VI, who died in captivity, referred to modern secular intellectual trends as a, quote, defiling plague of false philosophy, end quote. Pope Leo XII, who ruled from 1823 to 1829, actively condemned the theory of religious liberty as well as Freemasonry. He made full use of the Index of Forbidden Books, and he closely supervised the activity of the Vatican's Gregorian University. Just one more word on Pope Pius VII before we move on. He would also end up imprisoned by Napoleon when he was then emperor, and this would happen on a trip that St. Pius VII had taken to France, because Napoleon had invited him to France in order for Pope Pius VII to coronate him as emperor. Pope Pius VII certainly had his reservations, but he viewed this as an opportunity to, accept an olive branch from Napoleon and hopefully reestablish right relations with the new French secular state. And so he attended and he participated in this coronation ceremony, and then he would end up being imprisoned. He would outlive Napoleon's reign, however, and he would be able to return to the Vatican as a hero. Okay, let's move on. So Pope Pius VIII ruled from 1829 to 1830. He ruled very shortly, but during his short reign, he said that his sadness, quote, was due to the numberless errors and the teachings of perverse doctrines which, no longer secretly and clandestinely, but openly and vigorously attack the Catholic faith. You know how evil men have raised the standard of revolt against religion through philosophy, of which they proclaim themselves doctors, and through empty fallacies devised according to natural reason, end quote. Pope Gregory XVI, who reigned from 1831 to 1846, said, Academies and schools resound with new, monstrous opinions which openly attack the Catholic faith. This horrible and nefarious war is openly and even publicly waged. Thus, by institutions and by the example of teachers, the minds of the youth are corrupted, and a tremendous blow is dealt to religion, and the perversion of morals is spread. we're going to talk more about this in just a moment. We'll get back to this because we're going to go ahead now and we're going to discuss Marxism, because in the year 1848, the Communist Manifesto was published by Karl Marx. In the same year, a great number of revolutions took place with secular and somewhat Marxist ideals throughout Western civilization. So let's consider what the Communist Manifesto teaches, and then let's consider the Catholic response. So if you've never read the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, here's a summary of the main principles within. If you're at all familiar with communist thought, which you probably are if you're watching this channel, you're probably familiar with everything I'm going to say here, but let's review what Karl Marx actually wrote in the Communist Manifesto. So basically, Karl Marx was first and foremost a historian, and he was developing a new historiography, which is basically a lens with which to view history, or it's basically like the types of tools that a particular historian uses. So a traditional Christian historian is going to be looking for kind of the broad strokes of the hand of God throughout the history of any particular civilization. How is this nation being guided by God? How is it being rewarded by God? How is it being punished by God? And then for the most part, a Christian historian it's going to try to stay, as close as possible to the historical record, but it's just going to maybe look for glimpses of how God is acting. Okay, so Karl Marx is the absolute opposite of a Christian historian, and so he is trying to fashion a historiography that is purely materialistic and can find no cause for historical events that is not material. So he has very little place not only for an actual supernatural power or supernatural force, but he actually has very little place in his historiography for just people believing in religion in general. And even from like a secular perspective, that's really his biggest flaw, is he doesn't really comprehend that people can have just purely like religious motives for behaving a certain way. So Karl Marx believes that all of the major events in history are driven by the struggle between classes. The struggle between classes, particularly between the class that is in control of production of whatever is the main staple of an economy, and then the classes that are being oppressed. And so he believes that all of history is the story of the owners of production, the OOP, struggling to keep other classes subjugated to them so that they can retain the wealth and they can prevent a revolution from lower classes. So if you're really familiar with history, that's a crazy theory, that all of history is driven by that struggle between the owners of production and the underclasses that are working for them. It's extremely myopic. Karl Marx is writing about basically the year 1848. Okay, in the year 1848, Western Europe, or even Europe in general, was going through lots of industrialization, and that was a particularly hard period for the economy. In 1848, Europe was in the very depths of a pretty bad economic period with lots of layoffs, lots of unemployment, lots of starvation. And so there was a lot of discontent amongst the working class in that period. That's what Karl Marx is observing, and he's like projecting that struggle between the working class and then the bourgeoisie that owns which is his term for the class of people that are upper middle class that own the factories, but they're not quite nobility. That's the struggle he's observing, and he's projecting that type of a struggle on all of history. And if you have an overly simple, like, historiographical model like this, and you're just looking at every historical event and you're asking, okay, where can I see a class struggle here? Maybe you can find some evidence of that, but you're really, like, twisting the data to fit into a very narrow interpretation. It's bad history. But it's very popular history. If you study history in a secular university, you're going to have at least half your professors openly say they're a Marxist historian, because that's still the most popular school of historiography today. Probably the other half are all going to be postmodern historians, and then you'll have maybe a couple others that are using a different historiographical model in the closet. They can't admit if they're doing something else. So Marx believed the bourgeoisie, the owners of the factories, did serve a purpose in what he considered to be the inevitable path towards the communist revolution. So he believed that all societies would start as like simple farming villages. They would advance into like a feudal society with wealthy landowners and the majority of people in the society being poor peasants. So the wealthy landowners are the ruling class then, and then you have the peasants who are generating wealth for the landowners. Marx believed that the rise of the bourgeoisie opening factories served an important purpose in the scheme of history because the bourgeoisie would overthrow traditional patriarchal and feudal social orders. And the new industrial society would reduce all human relations to that of labor, cash, and materialism, which Marx argued was good. This was a much better social order than like a patriarchy or feudalism or a monarchical society or religious society. But even though Marx believed the bourgeoisie served an important purpose, he still believed they needed to be overthrown. He identified the great conflict of his day as being between the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class owning the capitalist class, which owned industrial capital and could start factories, and the proletariat, who were the majority of the people who were the working class. According to Marx, capitalism was an unstable system because it relegated more and more and more people from the population of a society to the dissatisfactory conditions of the working class, and eventually Marx believed the growing numbers of people in the working class would boil over into a revolution because the bourgeoisie would not be able to. Eventually the working class would realize they could easily overthrow the bourgeoisie and basically conquer and take control of the factories, and then the proletariat could be the owners of production. And that was what Marx considered to be the final stage of history. He also believed capitalism was doomed to fail because as factory owners grew wealthy, more members of the bourgeoisie would open factories, and increased production would cause supply to rise to such an amount that profits would fall, which would lead to more and more unemployment and more discontent amongst the proletariat, once again leading to a revolution. Marx believed that the ultimate communist revolution was inevitable. He believed that the forces of global economics would lead inevitably to a proletariat global society in which the working class would completely overthrow the social order, and the means of production would be collectively shared by the proletariat. For whatever reason, Karl Marx believed once the proletariat snapped and overthrew the bourgeoisie and took control of the factories, they would just decide to share it equally amongst themselves. And that's the most insane part of Marxism, that people would voluntarily just share. That's not how original sin works. That's not how human society has worked or ever has worked. Now, in this global communist society, social class would be erased. No one would own private property because all members of the communist society would voluntarily share all the wealth produced from the factories which were now collectively owned. Marx considered this utopia to be inevitable. The purpose of the state would be the manifestation of the communist society. So because nobody owns the resources, the means of production, the factory, and the wealth of society, but they're all equally sharing it, the people would appoint a state to moderate the economy and to oversee production and to organize the economy. But what that essentially means is the people have relinquished all of their rights to private property, which means the state now owns all property, all resources, all wealth, and all production in the nation. Once again, because the proletariat has now overthrown the bourgeoisie after the bourgeoisie had essentially overthrown the nobility of the feudal society, this new classless society would have no distinctions between people whatsoever. Men and women would be indistinguishable. Neither would be subjugated for the production of the other class. In Marx's view, women were even subjugated by men for the production of humans. Laying this sort of thought would lay the groundwork for modern reproductive butchery. The idea that feminism would raise that women needed to be liberated from being enslaved to reproduction. Absurdity, of course. There is nowhere in the animal kingdom where you would watch two animals having intercourse and not see that act as being connected to reproduction, except with feminism. Feminism has given Western society the idea that intercourse has nothing to do with reproduction, which is absolutely absurd, and that What I just said there is basically what's in the encyclical Humanae Vitae in a nutshell. It's absurd to think that intercourse has nothing to do with reproduction. We have grown culturally insane for thinking so. Other elements of the communist society of Karl Marx. Think of the John Lennon song, Imagine, where he says, "Imagine no religion, no God in heaven above." I think that's what he says. So John Lennon is, of course, that's a Marxist song, and that's basically the Marxist anthem of the late 20th century, because Karl Marx taught, quote, "Religion was conceived to be a powerful conservative force that served to perpetuate the domination of one social class at the expense of others." So he says religion was conceived, not just religion has been hijacked or manipulated, but religion was invented to continue to dominate social classes. So they are an invention of societies trying to subjugate lower classes. Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, he contributed a lot to Marxist thought in the 20th century, and when speaking to his cabinet in 1920, he foreshadowed the creation of international feminism. Because communists never wanted to just create a communist society in one nation. Because they believe the communist revolution is a global inevitability and it can only be accomplished through revolution, communists believe it is their duty to bring about those revolutions internationally. And so when Lenin took over Russia, they immediately set their eyes on how they were going to bring about communism in the rest of the world. And one element of that was feminism. If not called by name, he said, "We must create a powerful international women's movement on a clear theoretical basis." And that clear theoretical basis is, of course, feminism. It includes the patriarchy as described by feminists, which is not totally off. That is the order of the universe. It's beneath a father. That's the order of the perfect human society, the church. It's underneath the leadership of a father. It's the order of a family. It's under the leadership of a father. So patriarchy is not a fiction, but the hatred of it is certainly damaging to society. So he extensively wrote here in this quote, which you can pause and read if you'd like, about how women couldn't fulfill any job which men could do. He spoke to his cabinet in this speech in 1920, saying that women were indispensable in accomplishing the revolution, implying they were just as important as were men in the revolution. And then he describes all the different jobs he can put women on in the government, assuming that they have, complete capacities to do any job a man can do just as well as a man can do it. Implying that there's no objective difference between the genders, and laying the groundwork for feminism as well as later gender theory. Now, Marx and Friedrich Engels, his sidekick in the 19th century, neither of them were big fans of so-called LGBTQ issues or whatnot. Neither of them advocated for the tolerance of homosexuality. Both of them saw it as disordered. But Marxist politicians in the German Congress would later advocate for homosexuals to not be tried in criminal courts in the 19th centuries. These Marxists stated that the homosexual act was not disordered or unnatural, but was rather only not the norm and should therefore be legalized in Germany. So we see that early on Marxism and the homosexual gay stuff or whatever becomes merged together into one ideology. So Catholic responses to Marxism. I have a lot here, and I'm going to read you highlights from different documents. There were three main 19th century documents that responded to Marxism, two of which were written by Pope Pius IX, one by Pope Leo XIII. We'll look at some of these quotes here and just examine how the church responded to the growth of Marxism and communism throughout the 19th century. So in Nostis et Nobiscum, published in 1849, Pope Pius IX is responding to communism a bit. He's mostly responding to the revolutionaries that had actually driven him from the Vatican. And we're going to talk about that a lot in the next video, about the rise of the secular Western states. He actually writes that these people who are, I like this quote here, so we'll read it, just to look at the attitude that the popes had towards secularism. Pope Pius IX wrote, "The disorders of these revolutionaries include the unbridled license of thinking, speaking, and hearing every impious matter. They spread these like the foaming waves of a savage sea, and they exert themselves not only to shake the Catholic religion in Italy itself, but if possible, to utterly destroy it." And he wrote, "You are aware indeed that the goal of this most iniquitous plot is to drive people to overthrow the entire order of human affairs and to draw them over to the wicked theories of this socialism and communism by confusing them with perverted teachings." So he's saying that socialism, communism stands as the fulfillment of the secular revolution that's taking place in Italy right now. And he actually wrote that these people are trying to turn Italy to become a Protestant nation because he believed they knew that Protestantism gave the individual person license to interpret Scripture by themselves, independent of the received tradition. And he believed that the revolutionaries believed once they could get Italy to become Protestant, they could soon after get Italy to become Marxists. He wrote more about communism here, saying, "It is now generally known that the special goal of their proponents is to introduce to the people the pernicious fictions of socialism and communism by misapplying the terms liberty and equality. The final goal shared by these teachings, whether of communism or socialism, even if approached differently, is to excite by continuous disturbances workers and others, especially those of the lower classes, whom they have deceived by their lies and deluded by the promise of a happier condition. They are preparing them for plundering, stealing, and usurping first the churches and then everyone's property. After this, they will profane all law, human and divine, to destroy divine worship and to subvert the entire order of civil societies." That is a very accurate summary of what would happen in all nations which would fall to communist revolutions in the 20th century. You can pause if you want to read more here about how Pius IX was perceiving the corruption of the Italian people towards the kind of the black hole pole of communist thought. In 1864, the same pontiff would publish Quanta Cura. He wrote, "Moreover, not content with removing religion from public society, they wish to banish it also from private families. For teaching and professing the most fatal error of communism and socialism, they assert that, quote, domestic society or the family derives the whole principle of its existence from the civil law alone, and consequently that on civil law alone depend all rights of parents over their children, and especially that of providing for education," end quote. So that's huge right here. Pope Pius IX is perceiving in 1864 that the communists want to argue that the family is a institution which is created and regulated and governed not by God or natural law, but by the state. The state decides who gets to actually raise their children. The state could take the children away. The state can decide how the children are educated, and the state can decide what rights parents have or don't have over their children. And boy, is that relevant today in certain nations where horrifically children have been taken away from their parents, oftentimes in relation to the children believing teachings about their own gender from their teachers. And if they have decided to side with their teachers over their parents, some of these kids have been taken away from their parents. Or often in the case of like divorced parents, the parent who opposes the gender theory, in transition of their children will lose custody completely because of that. So Pope Pius IX is already seeing the seeds for what we're seeing today in American society and Canadian society. He's seeing that in 1864. Okay, so he does call the people to prayer here, and I just wanted to read a little bit of that. He said, "Let us implore, venerable brethren, God's mercy from our inmost heart, and with our whole mind, because he himself added, I will not remove my mercy from them. Let us ask, and we shall receive. And if there be delay and slowness in our receiving, because we have gravely offended, let us knock, because to him that knocketh it shall be opened. If only the door be knocked by our prayers, groans, and tears, in which we must persist and persevere. And if the prayer be unanimous, let each man pray to God, not for himself alone, but for all his brethren, as the Lord hath taught us to pray." Rerum Novarum is published by Pope Leo XIII in 1891. And in Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII acknowledges the challenges of industrialization. And he, in a sense, kind of empathizes with working class that are frustrated with those conditions. And he does suggest licit ways that the working class can seek out seek to better their working conditions and their living conditions. At the same time, Pope Leo XIII very systematically explains why Marxism is opposed to human nature. So he wrote that it's no surprise that the spirit of revolutionary change, which has long been disturbing the nations of the world, should have passed beyond the sphere of politics and made its influence felt in the cognate sphere of practical economics. The elements of the conflict now raging are unmistakable. In the vast expansion of industrial pursuits and the marvelous discoveries of science, in the changed relations between masters and workmen, in the enormous fortunes of some few individuals, and the utter poverty of the masses, in the increased self-reliance and closer mutual combination of the working classes, as also, finally, in the prevailing moral degeneracy. So, he says, in any case we see, and on this there is general agreement, that some opportune remedy must be found quickly for the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class. He says, for the ancient working man's guilds were abolished in the last century, and no other protective organization took their place. So he acknowledges that the old working guilds fell apart at the end of the 18th century, and there's no current guilds or unions to unify the workers, to stand up for one another's rights and protect one another. So this makes them susceptible to being abused by the employer. He acknowledges that. He says that public institutions and the laws set aside the ancient religion, because religious belief would have also protected the working classes, but all these secular states have set it aside. He says, hence by degrees it has come to pass that working men have been surrendered, isolated, and helpless to the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. So then he talks about the solution that socialists propose to deal with this crisis of the working class people. He says that socialists, working on the poor man's envy of the rich, are striving to do away with private property and contend that individual possessions should become the common property of all, to be administered by the state or other municipal bodies. They hold that by thus transferring property from private individuals to the community, the present mischievous state of things will be set to rights, inasmuch as each citizen will then get his fair share of whatever there is to enjoy. But their contentions are so clearly powerless to end the controversy that were they carried into effect, the working man himself would be among the first to suffer. That's a good prophecy of what will happen in the 1920s with mass starvation in communist Russia. They are moreover emphatically unjust, for they would rob the lawful possessor, distort the functions of the state, and create utter confusion in the community. So they're unjust because they will take what rightfully belongs to the wealthy. They will extremely gloat the state, because the state is there, once again, ideally, the state is there to direct people to God, and the executive branch of the state enforcing laws that keep right order in society, that's their job. Owning all property and coordinating the development of all resources, that is not the function of the state, and the state cannot accomplish that function. It's impossible. It will also create utter confusion in the community because you will utterly dismantle the very foundations of society by redistributing all resources artificially rather than through natural processes. You're going to utterly confuse the entire society, and that's not even mentioning the effects of communist ideology on religion. So Leo XIII argues that by transferring possessions of individuals to the community at large, the entire relationship between the workman and the employer will be destroyed, because the workman works in order to earn wages which he may dispose of as he sees fit. That's according to his human nature, his desire for freedom. He desires to earn wealth through his labor and then to use that wealth as he sees fit, hopefully to generate more wealth and develop the resources he has to better his own life and his family's life. Socialism cuts away at the relationship between the worker and the employer, and Leo XIII is suggesting that cutting away at the wage, the owning of private property, even the coins that the wage earner earns, will make that means of production through factories less effective. But Leo XIII again affirms that taking the property of the wealthy is a crime against justice. He says, for every man has by nature the right to possess property as his own. Is it just that the fruit of a man's own sweat and labor should be possessed and enjoyed by anyone else? As effects follow their cause, so it is just and right that the results of labor should belong to those who have bestowed their labor. Once again, if you want to pause and read these full excerpts, please feel free. Pope Leo XIII also notices that communism's ideal society would pose an imminent threat on the sanctity of the family. He writes, the contention, then, that the civil government should, at its option, intrude into and exercise intimate control over the family and the household is a great and pernicious error. True, if a family finds itself in exceeding distress, utterly deprived of counsel of friends, and without any prospect of extricating itself, it is right that extreme necessity be met by public aid, since each family is a part of the commonwealth. In like manner, if within the precincts of the household there occur grave disturbance of mutual rights, public authority should intervene to force each party to yield to the other its proper due, for this is not to deprive citizens of their rights, but justly and properly to safeguard and strengthen them. We see a recognition here in Pope Leo XIII's writings of human rights, which you could say he's been at least a bit inspired by the extensive talk of human rights and Enlightenment political thought. So he says the only role the family, the government has, the state has, in the interior functioning of the family is in helping the family through extreme destitution. He says that's a legitimate function of the state. Welfare can be extremely gloated beyond helping people in extreme destitution, but he does support welfare in events of extreme destitution. Now, he also says that if there's abuse, the state has the right to intervene and stop the abuse. But other than that, the family is its own cell and should function on its own without interference from the state. He writes that, but the rulers of the commonwealth must go no further. Here nature bids them stop. Paternal authority can be neither abolished nor absorbed by the state, for it has the same source as human life itself. The child belongs to the father and is, as it were, the continuation of the father's person or personality. And speaking strictly, the child takes its place in civil society, not of its own right, but in its quality as member of the family in which it was born. And for the very reason that the child belongs to the father, it is, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, before it attains the use of free will, under the power and the charge of its parents. The socialists, therefore, in setting aside the parent and setting up a state supervision, act against natural justice and destroy the structure of the home. We don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but when communist Russia would establish itself in the early 20th century, they would encourage putting up children for adoption. So they would set up these basically orphanages where the state would raise children from birth onwards. So that way people wouldn't have to raise children and become a family if they didn't want to, basically. The state liked the idea of raising children directly from the womb. It went so horrifically wrong. These child raising facilities were so poorly managed that many of the children chose to run away as soon as they could. And in the 1920s, Russia had a profound and devastating crisis of street children, many of which would starve and freeze to death. So it was utterly horrific. This is Pope Leo XIII arguing about how bad of an idea that is, 30 years before it was implemented in the Soviet Union. He also writes that it's a great mistake to say that the class is naturally hostile to other classes, that there's natural divisions between different social classes. He says that this is wrong and that men, the wealthy and the working men, are intended by nature to live in mutual conflict. He says that is wrong. He says, on the contrary, these two classes should be ordained by nature to dwell together in harmony and agreement, because capital cannot do without labor, nor labor without capital. Now, at the same time, Leo XIII is arguing that private property that the natural law affirms that people have a right to private property, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, it is lawful for a man to hold private property, and is also necessary for the carrying on of human existence. Pope Leo XIII says, but if the question be asked, how must one's possessions be used, the Church replies without hesitation in the words of the same holy doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas, man should not consider his material possessions as his own, but as common to all, so as to share them without hesitation when others are in need. Once the Apostle says, Command the rich of this world to offer with no stint to apportion largely. So we have a right to private property, and we need to have private property in order to know what resources are ours that we must cultivate, we will be held accountable for, that we must develop to generate greater wealth for our families and society. But then when we think about our wealth, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us to consider it as not being ours, but as belonging to all, so that we are always quick to open our hands in charity. Pope Leo XIII also says that those who are poor are taught by the Church that in God's sight poverty is no disgrace, and that there is nothing to be ashamed of in earning their bread by labor. This was enforced by what we see in Christ himself, who earned his bread by laboring as a carpenter. He also gives his commendation for Catholics who form holy working associations. He does say that those Catholics are worthy of all praise, and they are not a few who, understanding what the times require, have striven by various undertakings and endeavors to better the condition of the working class by rightful means. And he does list forming associations of workers as a rightful mean, as long as this association is, of course, godly and is not advocating Marxist ideas, the abolition of private property, or the establishment of a communist state. There's nothing wrong with an association of workers who can unite and confront the owner of the factory and, negotiate and demand better working conditions. So Pope Leo XIII is not opposed to what would come to be known as trade unions. However, I'm sure he would be opposed to trade unions that unilaterally advocate for Marxist ideas, as unfortunately many trade unions do today, giving their support unilaterally towards, Democrats or whatnot who support Marxist ideas and the massacre of unborn children. So now let's go back to the Catholic response to secular academia in general, now that we're done dealing with the issue of communism and Marxism and the Catholic response to that strain of secular thought. Blessed Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors condemned the notion that, quote, human reason without any reference whatsoever to God is the sole arbiter of truth and falsehood, of good and evil. It is law to itself and suffices by its natural force to secure the welfare of men and of nations. So he's condemning that notion, that is. In his Syllabus of Errors, which you can read, he is condemning all the errors of his time in the Syllabus of Errors. It's a real page-turner. I don't mean that ironically. I mean, you should read it. Blessed Pius IX, who reigned from 1846 to 1878, we just read from him, but he also said, a real zinger of a quote, I have always condemned liberal Catholicism, and I will condemn it again 40 times over if it be necessary. When presented with a book titled Liberalism is a Sin by a cleric who hoped that Pope Pius IX would put this book on the Index of Forbidden Books, Pope Pius IX actually read the book and enjoyed it so thoroughly that he recommended it to the general readership of the Church. Now, what exactly was meant by liberalism in this book? My first impression was that this book would be referring to liberal political movements like just democracy in general, but in reality, in this book, Father Felix Sardai Salvani was condemning he was condemning theological liberalism, he was condemning moral liberalism, which sought moral autonomy from the divine law, and it also touched on political liberalism, but that wasn't the only form of liberalism which Salvani was condemning, or that Pope Pius IX was commending to the Church. Vatican I is called in 1869, and if anything is to be criticized about Vatican I, it's that it was a little bit too late. It would have been great if the Church had summoned an ecumenical council, I don't know, in the 1790s, right after the French Revolution. It's hard to say what impact this council might have had if it was summoned at the very dawn of secular atheistic thought, not a century and a half after that sort of thought took over. But regardless, Vatican I is called basically to respond to the Enlightenment and the atheistic thought that's running rampant throughout the West. And the Council anathematized a great number of progressive academic views, including philosophical materialism and metaphysical theories, which blurs the line between the creator and the created universe. And, Vatican I is completely accessible. You can look it up here, Papal Encyclicals Online. If you want to see the propositions of secular academia which are being condemned, you can do a search and find function. And my computer's not working on that right now, but if you just click Control F, there it is. If you click Control F and you just type in anathema, okay, if you type in anathema, you're going to see that 41 41 times in this document the word anathema is used. Each time the word anathema is used, it's referring to a proposition of secular academia that's being condemned. That's how the church used to condemn things. It would say the teaching that was being condemned, and then it would say, let him be anathema who believes this. Let him be cursed who believes this. That goes back all the way to the Council of Nicaea. And it goes back to St. Paul as well. St. Paul used that term to describe people who are obstinately rejecting the tradition of the apostles. So you can read all the anathemas. We're going to talk about a few key ones here. So it defined as dogmatic the principle that the existence of God could be deduced from observable phenomenon. St. Paul talks about that in the first chapter of Romans, that basically pagans should have intuited the existence of God just by looking at creation itself. And so Vatican I is reaffirming that you can, through natural reason alone, come to the conclusion of the existence of God. Because of empiricism, which basically said that you can only come to truth by conducting like scientific experiments. Empiricists would say there's no scientific experiment that can prove God exists, therefore you shouldn't believe God exists. And Vatican I is saying, well, basically that's not the only way to derive truth. You can deduce from the existence of a physical universe the existence of a God who is the foundation of all being and the first cause of the universe. Foreshadowing St. Pius X's later condemnation of the principle of religious immanence, the idea that basically religious experience is unknowable and our words are imperfect attempts to describe it, Vatican I dogmatically declared that the scriptures could not be regarded as a merely fallible account of each writer's religious experience. Rather, the scriptures were objectively perfect in their articulation of divine truth. They were not feeble attempts to describe the ineffable, they were the inerrant word of God. Amongst the other dogmas pronounced at this dogma, it is worth noting that Vatican I also anathematized or damned the idea that, quote, human studies are to be treated with such a degree of liberty that their assertions may be maintained as true even when they are opposed to divine revelation, and that they may not be forbidden by the church. This is the idea of academic freedom that almost all Catholic universities in my country, the United States, assert today. Notre Dame University and the infamous Land O'Lakes statement basically argued against this dogma. So this dogma is saying it is a dogma that you can't believe this. You cannot believe that human studies scholarship must be severed from Catholic teaching in order to be done freely. In Notre Dame's Land O'Lakes statements, they written by President Theodore Hesburgh, and you know him, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick wrote this together. They argued that Notre Dame needed academic freedom in order to study each discipline in isolation from Catholic dogma in order to have the freedom to arrive at new truth. So they were explicitly heretical by saying that because this is a dogma of Vatican I. Okay. So a good academic scholar and theologian who was originally an Anglican bishop, but he did convert to become a Catholic bishop and would be named a cardinal. He is, of course, Cardinal John Henry Newman, and in 1870 he published a book titled The Grammar of Assent. It's not his most famous work, but it could have saved Western civilization, but it wasn't taken that seriously by secular academics. In this text, he directly attacked empiricism, the Enlightenment idea that it was foreign to human rationalism to express faith in any truths which could not be empirically verified. He famously asked the question as to how one could be certain that Britain was really an island. Have you ever walked around the entire thing, gotten from one end to the next, and made sure that there's no, land bridge connecting it to the continent? His point is, we live our whole lives giving assent to what we believe. We do not empirically verify almost anything throughout our lives. In a previous video, I asked, how do you know for sure the chair you're sitting on was built correctly? How do you know for sure the roof above you is not about to collapse? We don't live our lives empirically verifying everything that we believe, but we live giving our assent to things. So he says that it's not against human nature to give your assent to something just because you haven't empirically verified it. And for that reason, he says philosophy does not need to be dependent upon empirical verification of everything philosophers take as premises. So he's trying to open the door back to philosophy to accepting a theistic worldview. And of course, he is correct. there is a need for faith, even when God has given us a lot of evidence of his existence throughout time, countless miracles. Today we have countless Eucharistic miracles that can't be explained in any way other than the existence of God. You have these different miraculous things like the many miraculous elements of the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the manner in which that tilma survived for 500 years, even surviving attacks from acid and bombs, and just its own natural corrosion, which it should have done hundreds of years ago. There's lots of actual empirical evidence for God's existence, but even without that, we don't need that to give our assent to it, because it's reasonable to believe in God, and that's reason enough to believe in it. You don't need empirical proof to move forward on something. That's not how humans actually operate. Okay, let's look at some more quotes about the response to the Enlightenment from other popes. Let's look at Leo XIII, who said, "We have to oppose the rationalists, true children and inheritors of the older heretics, who, trusting in their turn to their own way of thinking, have rejected even the scraps and remnants of Christian belief which had been handed down to them. To them we must add not a few professors of other sciences who approve their views and give them assistance, and are urged to attack the Bible by a similar intolerance of revelation." Pope Leo XIII called the Church to a renewed study of St. Thomas Aquinas' work as a model of how to rightly utilize reason with the guiding light of faith. The traditional neo-Thomistic children's catechisms, such as the Baltimore Catechism of 1868, which was used in the United States all the way up until Vatican II, indicate that the heavily scholastic 19th century magisterial program was well received on the popular level throughout the Church, especially in the United States. St. Pius X's early 20th century crusade against modernism, then, as we have seen through this entire examination of 19th century polemics between the Catholic popes and theologians and Enlightenment thought, was not unique. St. Pius X was continuing a tradition of opposing progressive secular thought. He was not inventing a witch hunt, as many Catholic historians suggest. In his Pascendi Dominici Gregis, St. Pius X was concerned that without severity, modernism would continue to flourish within the Church. He wrote that modernists operated in each discipline as functional agnostics, limiting their presuppositions to the field of observable phenomenon, which they believed had, quote, no right and no power of lifting oneself up to God, end quote. St. Pius X believed that no individual could honestly claim to believe in divine revelation, while at the same time feel it was necessary to ignore the truths contained therein in order to conduct a scientific or historical investigation. St. Pius X especially condemned vital immanence, which he saw as the very center of modernist religious dogma. Vital immanence could be described as the idea that all religious doctrines were derived from an imperfect attempt to articulate an internal religious experience. In other words, vital immanence denies that anyone can know God completely, and it suggests that Catholicism is sort of one way of many ways to arrive at God, and the scriptures themselves are imperfect attempts to describe the ineffable religious experience. So, to modernists, Pope Pius X believed because of vital immanence, they would put Catholicism right on foot with other religions. He also argued that because of vital immanence, modernists would assert that, quote, in a living religion, everything is subject to change and must change in an evolution of doctrines to meet the unique needs of a given society. So vital immanence would say, well, fine, the way that they explained the Eucharist in the 13th century worked for them, but we need to explain that ineffable mystery in a new way today to make sense to today's people. And that's heretical, that's modernism. Since vital immanence perceived all religious doctrine as the inevitable, fallible attempt to describe the ineffable divine mystery, it was subject to change if the divine could be better described in different ways to reach different or modern people. Regarding their preoccupation with the idea that everything must change, St. Pius argued that evolution was, quote, the chief of their doctrines. Now, just for some context of ways in which evolution was the chief doctrine of modernist theologians, in a private letter, Father Teilhard de Chardin, a censored Jesuit priest, once wrote that he envisioned the formation of a, quote, new religion, let's call it an improved Christianity if you like, whose personal God would no longer be the great Neolithic God, landowner of times gone by, but the very soul of the world, end quote. I added the word very soul. I should have just said, but the soul of the world, end quote. So here, Teilhard de Chardin is both suggesting that Catholicism is going to evolve into a new religion and improve Christianity, And he's also voicing a Marxist idea that since the faith of Abraham emerged from a Neolithic society, he's saying more of a Bronze Age society, but he says Neolithic. Um, so he's basically saying that basically our God we worship is really just this invention of a Neolithic landowner type God. So that's just a Marxist nonsensical idea. Once again, you can read a lot more thoroughly about St. Pius X's opposition to modernism in my book, The Missal of St. Paul VI, um, found on Amazon. In 1910, St. Pius X published The Oath Against Modernism, and he required all teachers in Catholic institutions to swear this oath. And I'll read just a part of it here. I, Daniel Sudi, firmly embrace and accept each and every definition that has been set forth and declared by the unerring teaching authority of the Church, especially those principal truths which are directly opposed to the errors of this day. And that leads us to part 4, the rise of the 19th century secular states. And we're going to examine that very thoroughly in the very next video, and that will be the last one we cover before talking about World War I and its atheistic origins. Let's conclude with a prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti, Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti, may the Holy Spirit of truth remove from your minds anything I've said untrue or displeasing to him. All right, God bless you, and see you next time.